that we do not speak of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala unless we have a proof in the texts of the Sharia. The third or the fourth point that we come to is relating to the second half of this statement of At-Tahawi, وَكَلَّمَ اللَّهُ مُوسَى تَكْلِيمًا. وَكَلَّمَ اللَّهُ مُوسَى تَكْلِيمًا. Now, of course, we've already discussed the issue of kalam and taklim. We discussed it previously, and it will come again at a later stage in At-Tahawi's creed because it deals with it again. But at this point, the attribute of kalam that we ascribe to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, this kalam, this attribute, is one of those attributes which has two aspects to it. The first aspect is that this attribute of kalam is eternal, as in Allah has always had the attribute of kalam, right? In other words, He has never ceased to be one who speaks, right? He's never ceased to be one who speaks. And so here we say that this attribute is qadimun naw'. This is a phrase in Arabic, qadimun naw', which means that it is eternal in its type. In its generality, it is eternal. Meaning that in the general meaning of this word, Allah has always had the attribute of speech. Right. But then, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He speaks, all of these instances of His speech, they are what we say, they are recent. They are hadith. Hadith, meaning that they are recent. And the meaning of this is that when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He spoke to Adam alayhi salam, or when He spoke to the angels, right, He spoke to them with a speech that He hadn't spoken with before. So that speech was a recent speech. Then when He spoke to Adam alayhi salam, then when He spoke to Nuh alayhi salam, then when He spoke to Ibrahim alayhi salam, and so on and so forth. And then He will speak on Yawm al-Qiyamah. Okay. All of these are instances of the speech of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So on the one hand, Allah has eternally had the attribute of speech, meaning that He is one who can speak eternally. But then His speech is something that takes place, right? It is something that is tied to Allah's will. He speaks as and when He wills. So this, they say, hadithul ahad, that Allah's speech is eternal in its type, in its genus, in its general sense, but in its individual instances, it is recent. Right. Why is it that we have to mention both of these things? Right. The reason is because we don't want to be saying that every instance of Allah's speech is eternal, without beginning. This would mean that Allah speaking to Musa, Allah speaking to Adam alayhi salam, Allah speaking to Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, Allah speaking the Quran, Allah speaking the Tawrat, all of this only ever happened once in eternity and is eternal. This obviously is an incorrect meaning. Right? This is what the Ash'aris are trying to basically say, and say that everything is just like a meaning in the self of Allah. Right? So we say that it is eternal in its general meaning, and as for the individual instances, then it is recent. Now, it's not hard to understand because we can apply this even. We can't apply the same thing to creation, but to give you an idea, when a person is born, obviously he's not speaking, right? When a person is born, he is not one who is mutakallim. He acquires the attribute of speech. So he reaches maybe 2, 3, 4 years old, and then he speaks with speech which is meaningful, right? As for Allah, He is eternally one who speaks, right? But let's say, for argument's sake, a person begins to speak from the age of 3, and then he remains one who can speak, right? There are two aspects we can describe this person. We can say, this person is now mutakallim, right? He's mutakallim. He's now one who speaks. He has the attribute of kalam, right? But let's say on any given day, he might say a particular speech. He might say a certain speech. That speech was recent. That speech wasn't with him from the first day he started speaking. No. So that means that a person can have the attribute of kalam in general. Obviously, he's one who can speak. We affirm that, and it is a quality we cannot separate from him, that he has this attribute. But then, when He makes all of the individual instances of His speech, then we say that all of those instances, they are recent, right? But of course, for a person, his speech is created because he is created. He came to be after not being. He is originated. He was created from nothing. He came to be after not being. And therefore, everything which comes from Him, from His speech, from His actions, from His qualities, from His attributes, they are all created. But as for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He is eternal, without beginning, and also without end. Right? There is no beginning to His existence. There is no beginning to His attributes. Allah has been eternal with all of His attributes. He has eternally been one who speaks. But there are some from the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala which take place as actions. Right? When Allah speaks, it is an action. Right? He does so by way of His will. When Allah acts, Allah does actions. Allah does things like guiding people, misguiding people, raising people, lowering people. All of these are actions of Allah. So Allah, even though Allah is described eternally as the creator, creating is a permanent attribute of Allah. As for the individual instances of Allah creating, then they take place. They are recent, right? So when Allah created the Arsh, that was created before He created the seven heavens and the earth, right? And so it means that Allah's actions of creating, the instances of creating, are different and separate from each other. And so we can say about them that they are recent in their occurrence, right? So if Allah guides someone, Allah has recently guided someone. If Allah misguides someone, Allah has recently misguided someone. If Allah gives life to someone, Allah has recently given life to someone. These are the actions of Allah taking place, even though Allah is eternally the one who is Al-Muhyi, the one who gives life, Al-Mumit, the one who takes life, right? Al-Hadi, the one who guides, and so on and so forth. So the point being here that Al-Kalam, we affirm it for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah has eternally had this attribute of speech. But as for the individual instances of speech, because it is tied to Allah's will, Allah speaks as and when He wills, then we say about them that they are recent in their occurrence. And so after this, Shaykh mentions how this kalam that we affirm for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, meaning the individual instances of Allah's speech, that itself is of two categories. So meaning that the actual speech of Allah now, we've already established that Allah has the attribute of kalam. As for the actual individual instances of Allah's speech, then they fall into two categories. The first category is the kalam which is shar'i, al-kalamu shar'i, that kalam which relates to the legislation. So for example, the Quran is an example of this type of speech. The Torah is an example of this speech. The Injil is an example of this type of speech. Meaning, this is speech which Allah reveals to His servants in the form of books. And within these books there is legislation and commands and prohibitions. This is what we call al-kalam al-shar'i. So one type of kalam is this type of kalam. And the second type of kalam is the kalam that relates to the creation. Allah governing His creation. Allah ordering the angels, Allah commanding the angels to do things by way of which His creation is governed. And this is what we see in the Quran, mentioned in the Quran. Allah says, قُلْ لَوْ كَانَ الْبَحْرُ مِدَادًا لِكَلِمَاتِ رَبِّي لَنَفِدَ الْبَحْرُ قَبْلَ أَن تَنْفَدَ كَلِمَاتُ رَبِّي وَلَوْ جِئْنَا بِمِثْلِهِ مَدَدًا. That say, if the oceans were, if the oceans were like ink for the words of my Lord, then the oceans would have expired before the words of my Lord expired, even if you came with the likes of them. Surah Al-Kahf, at the end of Surah Kahf. This shows that the words of Allah never expire, and what is meant here is the words of Allah that relate to His the governing of the creation. Al-Kalam Al-Kawni. We call this one Al-Kalam Al-Kawni. And in another verse we see a similar meaning. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says, وَلَوْ أَنَّمَا فِي الْأَرْضِ مِنْ شَجَرَةٍ أَقْلَامٌ وَالْبَحْرُ يَمُدُّهُ مِنْ بَعْدِهِ سَبْعَةُ أَبْحُرٍ مَا نَفِدَتْ كَلِمَاتُ اللَّهِ إِنَّ اللَّهَ عَزِيزٌ حَكِيمٌ. That if in the earth there were trees, the pens made of trees, and oceans, which were like seven oceans, meaning of ink, then the words of your Lord would never expire along with all of that. Indeed, Allah is Almighty, All-Wise. So the point being here that there is the kalam of Allah, which is what we have in the revealed books. This is kalam that Allah spoke, which is legislation for His servants. And then there is the kalam that relates to governing the creation, and that is something that can never expire. And it is also for this reason that we see that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He refers to His speech as or He refers to it in the Quran as muhdath. Muhdath means of recent occurrence, something which is of recent occurrence. There are two ayat in the Quran. The first one is Surah Al-Isra, Surah 17, verse number 2. مَا يَأْتِيهِم مِّن ذِكْرٍ مِّن رَبِّهِم مُحْدَثٍ إِلَّا اسْتَمَعُوهُ وَهُمْ يَلْعَبُونَ. That no new reminder or remembrance comes to them from their Lord, except that they listen to it whilst they are engaged in vanity, whilst they are playing around and engaged in vanity. Meaning, no new revelation comes to them except whilst they are engaged in vanity and playing around. And a similar verse in Surah Ash-Shu'ara 26 verse 5, وَمَا يَأْتِيهِم مِّن ذِكْرٍ مِّنَ الرَّحْمَنِ مُحْدَثٍ إِلَّا كَانُوا عَنْهُ مُعْرِضِينَ. That no remembrance comes to them from Ar-Rahman of recent occurrence, which is recent, except that they turn away from it. Right. Now, an important point here is that when we say that something from Allah's speech is of recent occurrence, it took place, this does not mean that it is created. Right? This word muhdath does not equal makhluk. They're not the same thing. And this is one of the arguments of the Jahmiyyah and the Mu'tazila and the Ash'ari. This is one of the hallmarks of their belief, right? Where they try to say that if something is of recent occurrence from Allah, it means Allah must be subject to events, and therefore He must be a body, right? So it is on this basis that they deny Allah speaks with actual speech, Allah made istiwa over the throne, Allah descends to the lowest heaven, because these are actions that Allah performs. And actions, an action is something that didn't happen, then it happened, then it ended, right? And they're trying to avoid affirming this for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala based upon their ilmul kalam, based upon the proof that they're using to argue for the existence of a creator, right? It clashes with affirming actions for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? So the point being here that when we say that from Allah's kalam is that which is of recent occurrence, right? Like for example, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala spoke to Musa alayhi salam, that kalam was of recent occurrence. Isn't that correct? Had Allah spoken that kalam before? No. Right? When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He spoke to Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam, and He revealed the Quran, that was of recent occurrence, meaning that Allah spoke that speech. Allah spoke that speech. He didn't speak that speech in eternity. He spoke it, and Muhammad, it was conveyed to Muhammad. So that was of recent occurrence. So the point being here that when we say Allah's kalam is hadith, it is of recent occurrence, then it is not treated, that does not mean created. Why? Because Allah, anything that emanates from Allah, which comes from Allah of actions or speech or attributes, it cannot be created because Allah's essence is uncreated. Right? So, and we see that in the Sunnah, the Messenger of Allah, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he said regarding Ibn Mas'ud, radiyallahu anhu, he said, "Man sarrahu an yaqra al-Qur'ana ghaddan tariyan, kama unzil, فليقرأه على قراءة ابن أم عبد." That whoever is pleased that he should recite the Quran as fresh and new as it was revealed. He used the two words, غَضًّا طَرِيًّا. These two words mean fresh, new. كَمَا أُنزِل, as it was revealed, then let him recite it upon the recitation or upon the way of Ibn Ummi Abd, which is Ibn Mas'ud radiyallahu ta'ala anhu. Right? So describing what is meant here, when we say that Allah's speech is of recent occurrence, it does not mean it is created. Alright? These two things are not connected. Meaning that if we say Allah spoke with a speech which is of recent occurrence, or Allah's action in guiding someone was of recent occurrence, or Allah's action in giving life to someone was of recent occurrence, this does not mean that an act was created in the essence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is not this in the Arabic language, this doesn't exist. This is simply not possible to say that an act is something that is created in an individual. It's not the case. Even linguistically, it doesn't make sense in the Arabic language to claim that if someone doesn't act, right, that if Allah doesn't act, that act now is somehow created. No, it doesn't mean that at all. So anyway, this is the point that we finish with on the issue of kalam, and there will be some additional elaboration upon this at a later stage when At-Tahawi brings some more speech regarding the kalam of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But this brings us to an end to these 4 points made by the Shaykh, and we conclude today's lesson there. Inshallah, we'll continue with the next piece, which now deals with belief in the angels, the prophets and the books. So we'll conclude today's lesson there. If there's any questions on anything that's been said. The question from Paltalk regarding the influence of Aristotle on the Ahlul Bidah, but obviously this is referring to the Ahlul Kalam. You can find this elaborated in great detail and great length in the books of Shaykhul Islam Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah. From those books is Dar Ta'arud al-Aql wal-Naql, one of the famous books of Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah, where he is refuting all of the Ahlul Kalam in general. You can also find it in many of his other works in Majmu' al-Fatawa. So Ibn Taymiyyah is from those who has elaborated upon this in a great deal. You'll also find it mentioned in his book Aqidatul Hamawiyya. And in that book Al-Hamawiyya, Ibn Taymiyyah explains that this saying of denying the attributes that came from Al-Ja'ad bin Dirham, he took it from the philosophers amongst the Sabi'ah. The Sabi'ah were those people who Ibrahim alayhi salam was sent to, and they remained in and around the Muslim lands when Islam came. Now these people historically had been affected by the philosophy of Aristotle and the language and terminology of Aristotle. So amongst the Sabi'ah there were philosophers, and they had turned to star worship. And obviously Aristotle, when you look at the theology of Aristotle and Plato, it is all based upon the claiming the planetary bodies. They have a whole thing based upon the planets and the stars. So these philosophers amongst the Sabi'ah they had culture and civilization and learning, and many learning centers, and there were many philosophers amongst them, and they were affected by that language and terminology of Aristotle. All of this is there present in history. You'll find it even amongst the non-Muslim researchers. You will find them mentioning that Al-Ja'ad bin Dirham and Al-Jahm bin Safwan, that when he brought a theology in the 2nd century Hijrah, it was remarkably similar to the theology of the likes of Plato and Aristotle. So this is not something that is actually disputable. It's all there, established in hard, solid historical fact. It's mentioned by certain of the Muslim scholars. And even those from the Ahlul Kalam who, the likes of Abu al-Hasan al-Ash'ari, in some of his later books, he actually affirms that the foundation of Ilmul Kalam itself, and we mean here this proof that they are using to prove Allah's existence, right? That this itself comes from the philosophers, So all of this is firmly established in the books of history. It isn't really something that can be disputed. But of course, you see that the Ahlul Kalam from the Ash'aris and Maturidis, they conceal this from their followers. They don't allow their followers to become so educated that they realize what the true origins of this kalam. You know, when they start saying about Allah, that Allah is not a jism, Allah is not a body, Allah is not an arad, Allah does not have motion, Allah does not have... This language, where does it come from? They won't tell you that this language, if you go and read the books of Aristotle, like Metaphysics 12, for example, you will find that Aristotle describing his Lord in exactly the same way. That there is a being which is an unmoved mover, meaning it is not subject to motion, and he does not have, he's not a jism, he's not a body, he's not subject to time and events, right? He's not an arad, right? He's indivisible. All this language is taken straight from Aristotle, right? And the reason why they were forced to use this language is they didn't come out wanting to describe Allah in that way. That wasn't their intention. They didn't come out wanting to describe Allah with these words. But what the mistake that they made is that when they started debating with the atheists who were present in their time and the philosophers, those philosophers, they were upon Greek philosophy. And they would speak about the universe and everything in the universe using this type of language, that everything is a body and all bodies have a'rad, have attributes. And this was the way that they were characterizing the world and the universe around them. So these Muslims, they came and they started using this same terminology as part of their proof that Allah exists. So when they became tangled in this speech, bodies and accidents and events, al-ajsam, al-jawahir, al-a'rad, al-hawadith, all of these, these were terms that were taken from the Greek philosophers, translated into Arabic and used in studying philosophy in the Arabic language. When they began to use these words, then they had to in turn be consistent and then speak of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in a certain way. And that's why they were forced to make ta'wil, and that's why they were forced to make tafweed later on. So all of this is very, very firmly established as a matter of historical fact. The only issue is that this is what the Ash'ari scholars and Maturidi scholars today, they conceal this historical fact from their followers. And that's part of the fraudulent nature of the creed that they are upon. If you want to read about this in more detail, go to ash'aris.com, ASHARIS.com, ash'aris.com. You will find many articles that establish this without any dispute. There are many articles on that website, ash'aris.com, and you will find many articles specifically dealing with Aristotle and his philosophy, and how the Ahlul Kalam how they took it from him. Or we can clearly see the signature. It's just clear there in plain black and white that it's actually all there. Now, Ash'aris with a S, ash'aris.com. No, IS. Remove the A. Yeah, so you can refer to that website for further elaboration on this topic. Yeah, the book of Aristotle you can refer to is there's a volume called Metaphysics, and there are different sections in that book. But if you refer to Metaphysics 12, it's a section in there. You find Aristotle outlining a proof that there exists behind the universe, that there is an agent behind the universe, right? And his proof basically is along the lines that when we look at everything in the universe, we see it's in motion. We see that it's in motion. The whole universe is in motion. And he argues that this is a proof that the universe has eternally been in motion. Right. Then he says that, that behind this motion there has to be an unmoved mover. Right? Everything is moving, but behind it there has to be an unmoved mover. Otherwise we would have an infinite chain of events going in the past, that one thing moves another thing, then that thing is moved by another thing, then that thing is moved by another thing. We'd go back in eternity. So he says that there has to be an unmoved mover. Right? This is the Lord of Aristotle. Right? This is what he identifies as being the originator of the heavens and the earth. So once he argues that, and he uses this issue of motion and rest, right? Then he goes on to describe what this Lord is. This Lord isn't in space, isn't in time, isn't a body, isn't an accident, that's all the language that you see filled in the books of Ahlul Kalam. So what the Ahlul Kalam did is that they essentially took the basic elements of this proof here. Right. Now the thing is, they didn't take it from Aristotle directly, because before Islam there were other nations. There were Jews, there were Christians, there were Sabians, and they became affected by this as well from Aristotle. And through them, it came to the Muslims. Right? That's how it came into the Muslims, and this is how the whole theology and language of Ahlul Kalam came into the Ummah. Okay, we'll conclude our lesson there for today, inshallah. Subhanakallahumma wa bihamdika ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta wa astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk.